You wake up tomorrow morning already tired. Your alarm goes off before your body's ready. You check your phone before you even sit up. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet dread starts building for the 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours you're about to spend at a job. You assume this is just what being human means. Wake up. Work. Come home exhausted. Repeat. But the real answer is far stranger. For almost the entire history of our species, humans did not have jobs. No offices, no shifts, no bosses, no alarm clock screaming at dawn. And according to the people who study this most closely, our ancestors were not exhausted, overworked, or stressed about survival the way you might imagine. They were, in a very real sense, working less than you. Let that sit for a moment. Less than you. For 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived without a single job description. So what exactly filled their day? What did they do with all that time if they weren't clocking in somewhere? The answer starts with a number that shocked the entire field of anthropology. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee traveled to the Kalahari Desert to study the Ju-Hwanzi people, a hunter-gatherer community who still lived largely as humans had for millennia. He expected to find a population on the edge of starvation, spending nearly every waking hour searching for food. Instead, he found something almost unbelievable. Lee tracked how many hours adults spent finding and preparing food. The number came out to roughly 15 to 20 hours a week. Read that again. 15 to 20 hours. Not 50. Not 60. 20. The rest of their time wasn't spent panicking about survival. It was spent resting, talking, making tools, telling stories, and simply existing with other people. This data became the foundation for one of the most famous ideas in anthropology, proposed by a researcher named Marshall Solins in 1972. He called it the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more stuff than you. Affluent because they had more time than you. Solins argued that wealth isn't just about how much you own. It's about how much of your life you actually control. And by that definition, a hunter-gatherer with almost no possessions might have been richer than a modern office worker with a mortgage, a car payment, and a calendar full of meetings.
Does that sound impossible? It should, because everything you've been told about primitive life points the other way. You've probably pictured early humans as constantly desperate, digging for roots, chasing prey for hours, starving through winters, barely surviving until the next sunrise. That image isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete, and in many ways, it's backwards. Ancient human life wasn't a non-stop grind. It moved in rhythms, bursts of intense effort, like a hunt or a big harvest of nuts or berries, followed by long stretches of rest, socializing, and doing very little at all. A more recent researcher, anthropologist James Suzman, spent years living among the Ju-Hwanzi, and later wrote about this pattern in his book on the history of human work. Suzman noted that many foraging societies didn't separate work from life the way you do. There was no clocking out because there was no clocking in. You go to a job, they simply live their day. Think about what that actually means. No commute, no performance review, no inbox waiting at 6 a.m., no sense of being owned by a schedule someone else created. Instead, their days were shaped by something much older and much simpler: need. If there was enough food stored or gathered, people didn't go looking for more. Why would they? There was no boss demanding productivity. There was no quota. Once the need was met, the day belonged to them. So, what did they actually do with that freedom? A huge amount of the day was social. Talking wasn't a break from real life. It was a core part of it. Around a fire or under shade in the heat of the afternoon, people told stories, argued, gossiped, taught children, and passed down knowledge that had never been written down anywhere. This wasn't idle chatter. Storytelling was how survival knowledge moved from one generation.
Children weren't sent to a separate building to learn. They learned by watching, by playing, by being handed small tasks that mattered. A child sharpening a stick wasn't doing homework. They were becoming useful at their own pace without deadlines. And play mattered more than you'd expect. Adults played too. Music, games, dancing around a fire at night. These weren't luxuries reserved for after real work was done. They were woven directly into daily life because there was no separation between productive time and personal time in the first place. There's another piece of this puzzle that rarely makes it into the conversation: sleep. You probably assume ancient humans slept in long, unbroken blocks the moment the sun went down, exhausted from a hard day of survival. A researcher named Jerome Siegel decided to actually test that assumption. He studied sleep patterns among three modern hunter gatherer groups, including the Hadza, using wearable trackers instead of guesswork. What he found broke another myth wide open. These groups slept on average around 6.5 hours a night, not more than you, often less. But here's the twist: they rarely reported insomnia. Their sleep was tied to actual darkness and actual temperature drops, not to a screen glowing in their hand at midnight. Their bodies simply followed the world around them instead of fighting against it. So even sleep, something you might assume was simpler back then, followed its own quiet logic. Not more rest, just rest that made sense. Now think about how the day was actually divided between people. Here's something that surprises most people. In many hunter-gatherer societies, gathering provided more consistent calories than hunting did. A hunt could fail for days. Gathering rarely failed completely, which means the unreliable hunter chasing prey across the plains often depended more on the steady, patient work of the gatherers than the other way around. Does that match the image you've been shown your whole life? Probably not. Here's where the story gets even stranger, though. Not everyone in early human groups was expected to work in the same way. There's a well-known idea in anthropology called the grandmother hypothesis, developed largely through the research of Kristen Hawkes. She studied the Hadza people of Tanzania, another hunter-gatherer group, and noticed something odd. Older women who could no longer have children were often the most active food gatherers in the entire community. Why would evolution favor women living decades past their reproductive years? Hawke's answer reshaped how scientists understand human lifespans. Grandmothers weren't retired, they were essential. Their labor gathering food freed up younger mothers to care for infants, and their knowledge, built over a lifetime, kept the whole group alive during hard seasons. In other words, one of the most important jobs in ancient human society wasn't hunting or building. It was grandmothering. Try putting that on a resume today. This tells you something important about what daily life actually revolved around. It wasn't individual achievement, it was the group. Survival wasn't something you earned alone through hustle. It was something shared, distributed across everyone from the smallest child to the oldest elder. Compare that to your own day for a second. You wake up and your labor is largely disconnected from the people around you. You might work for a company you'll never meet the owner of, producing something you'll never personally use, earning money you'll trade for food, grown by someone you'll also never meet. Every link in that chain is invisible. Ancient humans didn't have that kind of separation. If you gathered food, you saw the person eat it that same day. If you made a tool, you watched someone use it immediately. The connection between effort and outcome was immediate, visible, and personal. That directness might be one of the biggest differences between their days and yours. But it's important not to romanticize this too much. Life wasn't easy. Illness could be fatal without modern medicine. Droughts and hard seasons brought real hunger. There was no safety net beyond the group itself. The point isn't that ancient life was paradise. The point is that constant labor wasn't actually the defining feature of it. Danger, yes. Uncertainty, yes. But hour after hour of forced, monotonous, scheduled work, that's a much newer invention than most people assume. So when did things change? When did the 15-hour work week disappear? The shift began roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago with the rise of agriculture. Farming required something hunting and gathering never demanded in the same way: constant, repetitive, scheduled labor tied to the seasons, the harvest, and eventually ownership of land. Once land could be owned, some people began owning more of it than others. And once resources became unequal, work stopped being something you did to meet your own needs. It slowly became something you did for someone else's benefit too. Jobs as you understand them weren't born in some ancient cave. They were born much later out of agriculture, private property, and eventually industry, which means the anxious, scheduled, clock watching version of work that defines your week isn't ancient at all. It's incredibly recent, a tiny sliver at the very end of a 200,000-year story. Ironically, early farmers often worked harder and ate worse than the foragers before them. Skeletal remains from early agricultural settlements show shorter statures, more malnutrition, and more disease compared to hunter-gatherer skeletons from the same regions. Settling down and getting productive didn't automatically make life better. In some ways, it made it harder, just more stable and easier to control. That trade off, stability in exchange for freedom, is one you're still living inside today. You have more security than a Kalahari forager ever had. Refrigeration, medicine, electricity at the flip of a switch, but you also have something they didn't: a calendar that isn't fully yours, filled in by other people's demands before you even wake up. So the next time you're staring at a clock, waiting for your shift to end, ask yourself something. Is this exhaustion really human nature, or is it something else entirely? Something built, something that could have been built differently. Your ancestors didn't spend their days chasing productivity, they spent them gathering just enough, then returning to each other, talking, teaching, playing, resting in the shade while the sun did what it always did. Without asking anyone to clock in first, there was no ladder to climb, no performance metric measuring their worth against a stranger 3 time zones away. Their value wasn't calculated in output, it was measured in how well they could feed a child, teach a skill, or sit beside someone through a hard season. You carry that same wiring inside you even now, buried under deadlines. It's why an empty Saturday afternoon with people you love can feel more satisfying than a promotion. It's why a long, unstructured conversation around a table can feel more like real life than an entire week of emails. That feeling isn't nostalgia for a past you never lived. It's memory encoded far deeper than culture, from a version of being human that ran on need instead of ambition. Tonight, when your alarm goes off before your body is ready and you check your phone before you even sit up, remember this: the tiredness you feel isn't the ancient story of your species. It's a very new one. And somewhere underneath it, the old rhythm is still there waiting for you to notice it again.